My name is Doctor Julian Croft. I am 81 years old. The man who held that name was once a senior theoretical physicist for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. I was a man who believed that the universe, in all its terrifying complexity, was ultimately a system of elegant, knowable equations. I believed that for every mystery, there was a solution waiting to be written. Then I saw what the equations could really do. I saw what happened when you solved for a variable that should have been left as an unknown. The government I served believes that Dr. Julian Croft died of a sudden coronary event in his home in 1982. They were kind enough to send a very nice wreath to the empty casket at my funeral. I live now in a small clapboard house in a town that clings to the coast of Oregon. I watch the fog roll in from the Pacific. I like the fog. It blurs the edges of things. It softens the hard, sharp lines of the world. It makes the shadows indistinct. And I have, for 55 years, had a profound and all-consuming fear of sharp, distinct shadows. On bright sunny days, I do not go outside. I stay in my dimly lit living room, and I listen to the ticking of a grandfather clock that marks a time that is no longer truly mine. I'm speaking into a simple, store-bought cassette recorder. It is a primitive tool, a fossil from a forgotten age, but it is safe. It cannot be hacked. Its signal cannot be intercepted. It is just my voice, my words, turned into a pattern of rust on a thin strip of plastic. A ghost in a machine. And that is what I am. A ghost. A witness to a moment that was erased from time, but which is still happening, over and over again, in a forgotten corner of the Arizona desert. For more than half a century, I kept the faith. I maintained the silence. I signed the documents. The ones that promised a swift and permanent erasure from existence if I ever broke my oath. I did it because I was a young man who had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had shown me a truth so terrifying, I agreed to help them bury it. But 2 weeks ago, I received a package in the mail. A plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single 8x10 glossy photograph. It was a recent, high-resolution satellite image, and it was of a patch of desert I knew, with an intimacy that has haunted my every waking moment. It was a place officially designated Unincorporated Area 113, Yuma County. But we had another name for it. We called it the Tombstone Test Site. The photograph showed nothing. Just sand, rock, and scrub brush. An empty, featureless patch of nowhere. But tucked into the corner of the photo was a small white slip of paper. On it, typed in a simple, block font, were 3 words. The echoes are fading. I don't know who sent it. Another old ghost from the program, perhaps, dying and trying to clear his conscience. Or maybe it was them. A test. A way to see if the old dog could still be provoked. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the words told me that the quarantine might be failing. That the terrible, silent wound we inflicted on the world might finally be healing. And if it is healing, then the secret no longer needs to be kept. The truth can finally be told. The truth about Project Chimera. Not the one you've heard of. The first one. The truth about a weapon that wasn't designed to destroy matter, but to unravel time itself. It all happened in 1968. The world was on fire. Vietnam was raging. The Cold War was a festering open wound. And in the secret laboratories of the Pentagon, we were desperately searching for a new kind of deterrent. A weapon so powerful, so final, that it would make nuclear war obsolete. We found it. And it was so much worse than any atomic bomb. I was 26 years old, and I still believed that humanity, for all its flaws, was in control of its own destiny. That was the first and most terrible of all my miscalculations. In 1968, the air at DARPA was thick with a strange mixture of brilliant innovation an existential dread. We were the government's dreamers, the mad scientists, tasked with imagining the next generation of warfare. And the shadow that loomed over everything, the great, terrible beast we were all trying to tame, was the bomb, the nuclear arsenal. We had built a weapon that could end the world, and now we were trapped in a state of perpetual finger-on-the-button terror with the Soviets. The driving philosophy of the era was that the only way to prevent nuclear war was to invent something even more unthinkable. My field was theoretical physics, specifically quantum resonance and multidimensional theory. It was a field that was at the time more science fiction than practical science. We were exploring the very fabric of reality, the idea that our three-dimensional universe was just one membrane in a vast, multi-layered cosmos. And we were trying to find a way to weaponize that idea. The project was codenamed Chimera. Its goal was to create a non-nuclear, strategic-scale weapon, a bomb that could neutralize an enemy city, an entire army, without the radioactive fallout, without the world-ending consequences of a nuclear exchange. The theory was my own, an extension of my doctoral thesis. It was elegant, beautiful, and monstrous. The idea was not to destroy matter with a massive release of energy, like a nuclear bomb. The idea was to detach matter from its own temporal signature. Everything that exists, every atom, every object, moves through time. It has a now. It has a past. It has a future. My theory proposed that it might be possible to create a resonant frequency wave that could specifically target and disrupt this temporal signature. To, in essence, unstick an object from the flow of time. We weren't trying to build a bomb. We were trying to build a machine that could press the pause button on a specific area of reality. The device itself was a strange, beautiful thing. It wasn't a bomb in the traditional sense. It was a large, spherical cage of copper and silver coils, at the center of which was a core of a rare, radioactive isotope. When activated, the core would release a specific, controlled burst of exotic particles, which would be focused and amplified by the coils into a single, expanding wave of dimensional resonance. The wave wouldn't carry heat. It wouldn't carry kinetic force. It would, in theory, simply pass through matter, leaving everything physically untouched, but severing its connection to the present moment. The target would be, for all intents and purposes, frozen in the single instant of the blast. After 2 years of theoretical work and small-scale lab tests, we were ready for a full-scale field test. The location chosen was a remote, sun-scorched patch of the Yuma Desert in Arizona, a place we called the Tombstone test site. It was miles from any civilization, a valley of sand and rock that shimmered under a relentless, unforgiving sun. The target area was a mock military encampment. We had set it up with painstaking detail. There were a dozen M48 Patton tanks parked in a defensive formation. There were jeeps, supply trucks, a command tent, and there were the mannequins, 100 of them, dressed in full army fatigues. Some were positioned inside the vehicles in the driver's seats, at the machine gun mounts. Others were posed in vignettes of camp life. A group playing cards at a table, a soldier leaning against a jeep smoking a cigarette, a medic tending to a wounded comrade. It was a silent plastic army waiting for a silent theoretical apocalypse. The device, the Chimera Sphere, was placed on a 100-foot tower at the exact center of the encampment, Ground Zero. The observation post was a reinforced concrete bunker dug into the side of a mesa 5 miles away. On the day of the test, July 10th, 1968, the bunker was a pressure cooker of anticipation. It was crowded with DARPA scientists, Pentagon brass in their crisp uniforms, and a few of the ubiquitous quiet men in suits from the CIA, the ever-present auditors of the secret world. I was at the main control console, my hands sweating, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Beside me was Dr. Eris Thorne, the project's lead engineer. Eris was my mentor, a brilliant, pragmatic woman who had taken my wild theoretical physics and forged it into a working piece of hardware. She was the one who had made the equations real. The countdown was a tense, clipped, professional affair. High-speed cameras were rolling, sensors of every imaginable kind were active, ready to measure the wave, the resonance, the effect. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Detonation. I pressed the red button. We all braced for something. An explosion. A shockwave. A flash of light. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing. No sound. No light. No tremor in the earth. The desert outside the bunker's thick periscope window remained silent, peaceful, and utterly unchanged. The only indication that anything had happened was a strange, shimmering distortion in the air above the target site. It was like a heat haze, a ripple in reality that expanded outward from ground zero for a few seconds, and then simply vanished. A confused, disappointed murmur rippled through the bunker. "Is that it?" a general from the Pentagon barked. "What happened? Did the device fail?" I looked at my sensors. The data was streaming in. "Negative, General," I said, my own voice laced with a confusion that mirrored his. "All sensors indicate a full, successful detonation. The resonance wave was generated. It propagated perfectly. Everything worked." "Worked?" the general scoffed. "I don't see a damn thing, Doctor. The tanks are still there. The tents are still standing. It looks like you've invented the world's most expensive paperweight." He was right. On the long-range monitors, the mock encampment looked exactly as it had a minute ago. It was completely, utterly, physically untouched. There was no crater, no debris, no sign of any destructive force whatsoever. A wave of cold, professional dread washed over me. Failure. 2 years of work, billions of dollars, and it had been a complete, spectacular failure. My theory, my beautiful, elegant theory, was wrong. The device was useless. My career, I thought in that moment, was over. "Send in the preliminary survey team," Dr. Thorne ordered, her voice tight with a disappointment that matched my own. "Full radiation and chemical suits. Let's get a closer look at this dud." 2 hours later, after the all-clear was given, we drove out to the site. The mood in our Jeep was funereal. The Pentagon brass had already left, their disgust palpable. It was just me, Eris, and a few other shell-shocked scientists. We drove into the silent plastic encampment, and at first, everything seemed depressingly normal. The tanks were unscratched. The mannequins were undisturbed, frozen in their silent, lifeless poses. The playing cards were still on the table. The cigarette was still in the soldier's plastic hand. The weapon had done nothing. It was Eris who saw it first. She had stopped the Jeep and was just staring at the ground, her face a mask of profound, dawning confusion. "Julian," she said, her voice a strange, quiet whisper. "Look at the shadows." I followed her gaze. The sun was high in the afternoon sky, beating down on us from the west. And so, the shadows of the tanks, the jeeps, the mannequins, should have been cast long and sharp to the east. But they weren't. The shadows were there. They were dark, sharp, and perfectly defined on the baked, cracked earth. But they were all pointing in the wrong direction. They were pointing north, directly away from the tower at the center of the encampment, the point of the blast. They were frozen, static shadows, cast by a flash of invisible, non-existent light. We all got out of the Jeep, our feet crunching on the gravel. We walked over to one of the mannequins, the one leaning against the Jeep. The mannequin itself was casting a faint, proper shadow to the east, in line with the sun. But burned into the ground at its feet, like a dark stain, like a photograph of a shadow, was a second, much darker shadow. A shadow that was pointing north. A shadow from a moment that had already passed. The bomb hadn't failed. It had worked. In a way that was far more subtle and far more terrifying than we could have ever imagined. It hadn't destroyed the objects. It had just taken something from them. It had peeled their shadows away, leaving them fixed and permanent on the ground. It had left an echo, a scar, a tombstone, marking a single, silent moment in time. The initial shock of the discovery gave way to a frantic, feverish period of scientific investigation. The Tombstone site was immediately placed under a level of quarantine I had never witnessed before. A 5-mile perimeter was established, guarded by military police who were told only that they were guarding a site contaminated by a chemical spill. A no-fly zone was declared. The official story, leaked to the press by the Pentagon's quiet spin doctors, was that the Chimera test had been a complete and total failure, a billion-dollar boondoggle, and that the project was being scrapped. It was the first layer in a thick, insulating blanket of lies that would cover this place for the next half-century. Back at the site, we were a small, isolated team of scientists and military personnel trapped in a bubble of impossibility. Our world became that single, silent, sun-baked patch of desert. We were led by Dr. Thorne and myself, with Colonel Davis, a stern, pragmatic Air Force officer, acting as the military commander and our liaison to the unseen powers who were now pulling the strings. Our first task was to understand the nature of the shadows. They were not, we quickly determined, simply discolored patches of ground. They were not scorch marks or chemical stains. We took core samples of the soil. The dirt beneath the shadows was identical to the dirt next to them. There was no chemical change, no radiation, no physical alteration whatsoever. The shadows were something else. They were profoundly, unnaturally dark. A deep, flat, light-absorbing black that seemed to drink in the fierce Arizona sunlight. When you looked at them, it was like looking at a hole in the world. They had no temperature variance. On a day when the desert floor was hot enough to fry an egg, the shadows were the exact same temperature as the sunlit ground beside them. They were an absence, a null space, and they were permanent. As the sun moved across the sky, the real, natural shadows of the tanks and mannequins would sweep across the desert floor, lengthening, shortening, moving with the time of day. But these other shadows, the shadow stains, they remained fixed, immutable, all pointing north. A silent, ghostly compass needle pointing away from the ghost of a blast that had made no sound and no light. We spent days mapping them, photographing them, analyzing them with every sensor we could get our hands on. We were trying to quantify a miracle, trying to write an equation for a ghost. I remember one afternoon, I was working with Eris near one of the Patton tanks. The tank itself cast a long, blocky shadow to the east. But at its base, like a dark, spilled secret, was its other shadow, the fixed one. I knelt down, reaching out a hesitant, gloved hand. I wanted to touch it. "I wouldn't do that, Julian," Eris said, her voice sharp. She was looking at a portable spectrometer, its needle twitching erratically. "Why not?" I asked. "It's just an absence of light." "Is it?" she said, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "The sensors are picking up something. A quantum fluctuation. A faint, incredibly high-frequency vibration emanating from the perimeter of the shadow. It's not energy in a conventional sense. It's a resonance. The same frequency as the Chimera device, but at an incredibly low amplitude. Like a faint echo of the blast still ringing in the fabric of space-time. The idea was dizzying. The shadow wasn't just a stain. It was an active, ongoing event. A wound in reality that was still bleeding. Very, very slowly. The psychological toll of the place was immense. The silence was the worst part. It was a dead, listening silence. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The desert itself seemed to be holding its breath. And everywhere you looked, there was this profound, visual wrongness. The landscape was a surrealist painting, a world where the fundamental rule of light and shadow had been broken. It created a deep, primal sense of unease, a feeling that the very laws of physics were unstable, that the world was not the solid, dependable place we believed it to be. We began to call the shadows echoes. It felt more accurate. They were echoes of a moment, the moment of detonation. We had taken a single instant, 9:07 a.m., on July 10th, 1968, and we had somehow imprinted it onto the world. We had turned a moment into a monument. The mannequins were the most disturbing part. Their silent plastic faces, their frozen, lifeless poses had been unnerving enough to begin with. But now, with their dark, permanent shadows clinging to their feet, they looked like something else. They looked like their own gravestones. Each mannequin was a silent testament to its own theoretical death, its shadow a permanent record of the moment it had been killed. The entire site was a cemetery of moments, a tombstone for a single, murdered second. We fell into a routine of paranoia and obsessive work. We slept in temporary shelters, but no one really slept. We would lie there in the dark, listening to the silence, and we would imagine we could hear the faint, high-frequency hum that Eris's sensors had detected. We would dream of a world of wrong shadows, of a sun that cast no light. On the 5th day, a young physicist on the team, a brilliant kid named Peterson, had a breakdown. We found him in the center of the test site, near the base of the tower where the device had been. He was on his hands and knees, weeping, clawing at the shadow of the tower that was stained onto the ground. "I can't find the edge," he was screaming, his voice raw with terror. "There's no edge. It just keeps going down." We had to sedate him and fly him out. The official report said he had suffered from acute heat stroke and dehydration. But we knew the truth. He had just stared into the hole in the world for too long. It was after Peterson was evacuated that Colonel Davis made the call. He gathered what was left of our small, frayed team. "This is no longer a scientific study," he announced, his voice grim. "This is a containment operation. The Pentagon has made a decision. No one else comes in. Nothing gets out. We are to observe, to record, but we are not to interact. Our mission is to watch these things until we understand what they are and what they might do." He looked around at our tired, haunted faces. "And we have a new name for this place," he said. "Officially, it's Unincorporated Area 113. But for the purposes of this operation, for our reports back to the JCS, we are to refer to this as Incident Tombstone." The name was perfect. It captured the profound, sepulchral stillness of the place. We were not scientists in a test site. We were custodians of a graveyard where the dead were not people, but moments. And we were about to learn that the dead do not always rest in peace. The shadows were not just a stain. They were sleeping, and they were about to wake up. The shift from scientific investigation to passive containment changed the atmosphere at Tombstone from one of frantic discovery to a kind of slow-burning, high-tension dread. We were no longer trying to solve a puzzle. We were on watch. We were guards in a prison where the inmates were made of nothingness, and the bars were our own fear and incomprehension. Our lives fell into a monotonous, paranoid rhythm. We would spend 12-hour shifts in a new, more heavily reinforced observation post that had been erected at the edge of the perimeter. We would watch the target area through high-powered telescopes and a battery of remote sensors. We watched the sun rise, casting its long, proper shadows to the west. We watched it climb high in the sky, shrinking the real shadows to small, dark pools at the feet of the tanks and mannequins. We watched it set, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple, stretching the real shadows out to the east. And all the while, the echo shadows remained fixed, stubborn, and utterly, terrifyingly wrong. A constant, silent rebellion against the laws of nature. The silence of the place began to work on us in insidious ways. It was a silence so profound that it became a presence in itself. After a week of it, you would start to hear things that weren't there. A faint, high-pitched ringing in your ears that you could almost convince yourself was the hum of Eris's resonance. A whisper on the edge of the wind that sounded for a fleeting moment like a human voice. We were living in a sensory deprivation chamber the size of a valley, and our own minds, starved for input, were beginning to create their own ghosts. I spent most of my time with Eris. We were the only two left from the original Chimera design team. We shared a bond of guilt and terror that no one else could understand. We had made this place. This wound in the world was our intellectual offspring. What if they never change? I asked her one night. We were sitting in the observation post, the world outside bathed in the cold, sterile light of the military floodlights. The echo shadows were even more stark, more absolute in the artificial light. What if they just stay like this forever? A permanent, static scar. I don't think so, Julian, she said, her eyes fixed on a monitor that showed a close-up of one of the mannequin echoes. There's nothing in nature that is truly static. The universe is a process. It is a state of constant change. What we are seeing here is not an end state. It is a transition. The system is in a state of high potential energy. It's waiting for something to lower its energy state, to stabilize. Her words were prophetic. The change came on the 14th day of our vigil. It was just after dawn. The sun was a brilliant, fiery orange on the eastern horizon. I was on watch, scanning the encampment with a powerful telescope. I was focused on the group of mannequins who were posed around the card table. Their real shadows were long and thin, stretching out behind them. Their echo shadows were dark, sharp patches at their feet, pointing north. It was the same surreal tableau I had looked at 100 times. And then I saw it. I blinked, convinced my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. I looked again. It was real. The echo shadow of one of the mannequins, the one that was reaching for a card on the table, had moved. It had shifted on the ground by maybe an inch. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change. But in a place defined by its absolute unnatural stillness, it was as dramatic as a nuclear explosion. My hand was shaking as I hit the alarm button. Eris! Colonel! Get in here! Now! Within seconds, they were at my side, their own eyes pressed to the optics. What is it? Colonel Davis demanded. The echo, I said, my voice a strangled whisper. The one at the card table. It moved. We watched, our breath held for what felt like an eternity, and then it happened again. The dark, two-dimensional shape on the ground slid with a slow, silent, liquid grace. Another few inches. It was no longer perfectly aligned with the moment of the blast. It was detaching itself from its origin. And then another shadow moved. And another. All across the test site, the silent, static echoes were beginning to stir. The shadow of a tank's turret slowly, impossibly, rotated on the ground. The shadow of the soldier leaning against the jeep began to straighten up. The graveyard was coming to life. Within an hour, the phenomenon had spread to every echo on the site. They were no longer just stains on the ground. They were detaching themselves completely, peeling themselves off the sand and rock like dark, wet decals. They became independent, two-dimensional objects, gliding across the surface of the desert with a silent, fluid motion that was utterly horrifying to watch. They were no longer pointing north. They were moving freely, but they were not moving randomly. We realized with a new and profound wave of terror that they were reenacting the moment of the blast. The two-dimensional shadow of the mannequin at the card table would reach for the shadow of the card. The shadow of the tank turret would rotate to face the shadow of an unseen enemy. The shadow of the medic would bend over the shadow of the wounded soldier. And they would do it over and over again. They were trapped in a silent, two-dimensional, ghostly loop, a pantomime of a moment that was now repeating for eternity. They were the living, moving echoes of a dead second. The Tombstone had become a theater of ghosts, a silent, black and white movie projected onto the floor of the desert, its actors made of pure, animated nothingness. We were watching a memory that had been given a life of its own. The day was spent in a state of horrified, rapt observation. We recorded everything. We filmed the silent, looping dance of the two-dimensional ghosts. The data we were collecting was rewriting the books on physics, on reality itself. But the sense of scientific discovery was completely overshadowed by a deep, primal, and instinctual fear. We were looking at something that should not be, something that was a fundamental violation of the natural order. The final, terrible escalation came in the late afternoon. One of the younger scientists, a physicist named Franklin, had been tasked with getting a closer reading. Against Eris's strenuous objections, Colonel Davis had ordered him to take a portable sensor array and approach the perimeter of the active shadow field. Franklin was a good scientist, brave, but a little reckless. He was fascinated, not scared. We watched on the monitors as he walked slowly towards the edge of the encampment, his own real shadow stretching out long behind him in the late afternoon sun. He was approaching the dancing shadow of the card players. He got to within 10 feet of them. The flat, black shapes continued their silent, looping pantomime, seemingly unaware of his presence. And then it happened. One of the shadow figures, the one that had first moved, suddenly stopped its loop. It turned. It seemed to notice him. The two-dimensional shape detached itself from its eternal card game and began to glide towards Franklin. "Franklin, get back!" Eris screamed into the radio. But it was too late. The shadow creature moved with an impossible speed. It flowed over the ground like a spill of black ink. It reached Franklin, and it did not attack him. It didn't touch his body. It touched his shadow. We watched, in mute, absolute horror, as the dark, two-dimensional entity seemed to merge with Franklin's own real shadow. For a second, they were one. And then they separated. The echo shadow glided back to its card table, to its endless looping game. And it was not alone. It was dragging a piece of Franklin's shadow with it, a dark, trailing ribbon of nothingness. But the most terrible part was what had happened to Franklin himself. We saw him stumble back, and we saw the ground where his shadow should have been. It was empty. The bright desert sun was beating down on him, but he cast no shadow. None at all. He was a solid object in a world of light, and he had no darkness to cast. His body stood there, frozen, for a moment. Then he collapsed to the ground. His own shadow, his real, proper shadow, was now on the ground at the card table. It had gotten to its feet, and it was now playing its own part in the silent, repeating two-dimensional play. It was reaching for the card, over and over and over again. Franklin was not dead. We recovered his body. He was breathing. His heart was beating. But his eyes were open, vacant, and utterly, completely blank. He was a shell, a body with no one inside. The bomb had not just taken the shadows of the objects. It had taken the shadow of a man, and it had taken his soul with it. The echoes were not just memories. They were hungry, and they were feeding on the very essence of what it meant to be alive. Franklin's fate was the final, brutal punctuation mark on our experiment. The line had been crossed. The anomaly was no longer a passive, albeit terrifying phenomenon. It was active. It was predatory. And it was hostile to human life in a way we had no defense against. It didn't attack the body. It attacked the soul, the consciousness, the very thing that made a person, and it did so by stealing their shadow. The esoteric philosophical horror had become a stark medical and military reality. The reaction from the powers that be was swift and absolute. Colonel Davis was on the secure line for hours, his voice a low, grim monotone. The tenor of the conversation had changed. There was no more talk of study, of understanding. The only words I could make out were containment, denial, and sterilization. Within 24 hours, the nature of the Tombstone site was transformed again. A fleet of heavy transport helicopters arrived, not with more scientific equipment, but with construction materials and military engineers. They began to build a fence, not just a simple chain-link fence, but a massive 20-foot-high solid steel wall, a blank, windowless barrier that would surround the entire 5-mile perimeter. It was a wall designed not just to keep people out, but to keep eyes out, to create a box, a tomb. Our small scientific team was unceremoniously disbanded. We were debriefed one by one in a sterile, windowless room by a new set of quiet men in suits who had arrived with the engineers. These were not the curious auditors from the test day. These were men from the Pentagon's most secret and ruthless sanitation department. Their job was not to understand the mess, but to clean it up. My debriefing was a chilling, surreal experience. They didn't ask me about my theories on temporal physics. They asked me who I had spoken to, what I had written down, where my notes were. They were not scientists. They were counterintelligence officers, and the enemy was the truth itself. They made it explicitly, terrifyingly clear that the events at Tombstone had never happened. That the official report, the one that stated the Chimera device was a failed dud, was the only reality that was now permitted to exist. Any deviation from that reality would be considered an act of treason. Dr. Croft, the man questioning me, said, his voice as soft and dangerous as falling silk, "You and Dr. Thorne created a remarkable device. A failed device, of course, but a remarkable attempt. The government thanks you for your service. Now, you will go home. You will never speak of this project again. You will never contact any other member of your team. You will forget the name Tombstone. You will, for all intents and purposes, forget the last month of your life. In return, you will be allowed to continue your academic career. Your life will be your own, so long as you remain silent." It was not a request. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of a generous retirement package. I last saw Eris as she was being escorted to her own debriefing. We caught each other's eyes for a brief moment across the dusty, chaotic construction site. There was a universe of unspoken words in that single glance. Guilt, fear, a shared, terrible, and now forbidden knowledge. Then she was gone. I never saw her again. I heard, years later, that she had been transferred to a black site research facility in the depths of the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, a brilliant mind locked away in a cage of secrecy, tasked with studying a phenomenon she was never allowed to speak of. I was sent home, back to my quiet life as a university professor, and I tried to forget. I buried myself in my work, in the safe, predictable, and sane world of textbook physics. I tried to convince myself that what I had seen in the desert was a dream, a stress-induced hallucination, but I could never forget the image of Franklin, standing shadowless in the sun, his eyes as empty as a vacant house. And I could never forget the final conversation I had with Eris the night before they broke up our team. We were sitting in the observation post, watching the silent, looping dance of the shadow ghosts on the monitors. "It's not a weapon," she had whispered, her voice filled with a kind of awe-struck horror. We were so arrogant. We thought we were building a bomb, but we were just clumsy children banging on the side of a drum we didn't understand. "What is it then?" I asked. I think the bomb worked perfectly, Julian," she said. "Your theory was right. We created a resonance wave that separated an object from its temporal signature. But we misunderstood what a temporal signature is. We thought it was a property of the object, an energy field, something that could be stripped away." She pointed to the monitor, to the dark, two-dimensional shape of a soldier, endlessly reloading a gun that wasn't there. But a shadow is not a property of an object. A shadow is a record. It is a two-dimensional record of the interaction between light and object and time. And a temporal signature. It's not just a property, it's a memory. It's the memory of an object's existence in time. It's now. She turned to me, her eyes wide with the terrifying beauty of her conclusion. "We didn't build a bomb that freezes things in time, Julian. We built a bomb that separates an object from its own memory, from its own now. And what is left behind when you strip away the present moment? The past. A living, repeating echo of the last moment the object was whole. The shadows aren't ghosts. They are memories. Memories that have been given a life of their own. And Franklin, we didn't just steal his shadow. We stole his present. We ripped him out of his own timeline and left him adrift. His body is here, but his now is trapped at that card table, forever reaching for a card that will never be played. The official report, the one I was forced to sign my name to, stated that the Chimera weapon was a failure. That was the greatest lie of all. The weapon was a success so profound, so terrifying, that we had to build a wall around it and pretend it never existed. We had created a weapon that did not kill the body, but murdered the soul. And we had, in our hubris, created a permanent, quarantined, and living monument to our own terrible power. The Tombstone site was not a test site. It was a wound in time. And the secret that the Pentagon was hiding was not the failure of a weapon, but its horrifying, unimaginable success. The years after Tombstone were a long, slow lesson in the art of living with a ghost. Not a literal ghost, but a ghost of knowledge. A constant, silent companion that sat with me in my quiet office, that walked with me through the hallowed, oblivious halls of the university. I taught the laws of physics to bright-eyed students. I filled chalkboards with equations that described a neat, orderly, predictable universe. And all the while, I knew that just a few hundred miles away, in a secret, walled-off patch of desert, there was a place where all those beautiful laws had been broken, where shadows danced to the rhythm of a dead moment in time. The hypocrisy was a constant sour taste in my mouth. I kept my silence. I honored my terrible bargain. I published papers on string theory and quantum chromodynamics, safe, theoretical, abstract fields that were as far removed from the brutal, practical reality of what we had done as possible. I built a new life, a new identity, as a respected, if somewhat reclusive, academic. The ghost of Julian Croft, the young, ambitious DARPA physicist, was buried deep. But I never stopped thinking about it. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, and I would run the equations in my head. Eris's final theory became the central obsession of my life. A weapon that separates an object from its memory. A bomb that creates a living echo of the past. The implications were staggering. What if we had used it on a city? On Moscow? On Beijing? Would we have created a city of silent, two-dimensional ghosts, reenacting the last mundane moments of their lives for all eternity? A city of shadow people going to work, making dinner, kissing their children, a silent, looping, two-dimensional hell. The moral and philosophical questions were monstrous. It was a weapon that didn't just kill, it damned. It created a permanent, visible, and eternal monument to its own atrocity. Perhaps that was why the Pentagon had buried it so deep. It was a weapon too terrible to use, not because of the destruction it caused, but because of the evidence it left behind. A nuclear bomb leaves a crater. The Chimera bomb left a conscience. I tried to follow the whispers, the faint echoes of the project in the deep black world. I knew they wouldn't have just abandoned the research. A power that profound is never simply forgotten. They would have taken it, classified it beyond top secret, and continued the work in some deeper, darker hole. I searched for Eris, using the tentative, discreet feelers of old academic contacts. I found nothing. It was as if she had been erased from the face of the earth. She was a ghost, too, trapped in her own kind of tombstone, a prison of government secrecy. And what of the site itself? I knew they were monitoring it. The satellite photo I received was proof of that. Someone was still watching the echoes. Someone was still studying the wound. Were the shadows still dancing their silent looping ballet? Or had they changed, evolved? Had they, in their timeless, two-dimensional world, developed some new and terrifying property? The questions were a constant low-grade fever in my mind. Then came the package, the plain manila envelope, the satellite photo of the empty desert, and the 3 typewritten words. The echoes are fading. Those words were not a comfort. They were a new kind of terror. Fading. How could they be fading? How could a permanent scar on time begin to heal? I had believed the phenomenon to be eternal, a fixed point of horror. But if it was fading, that meant it was a process. It had a lifespan. And if it had a lifespan, it had an energy source. And if that energy source was depleting, what would happen when it was gone? Would the shadows simply vanish? Would the desert floor return to normal, leaving no trace of the horror that had transpired there? Or would it be something worse? My mind, the mind of a physicist, raced through the possibilities. What if the separation of the temporal signature was not a permanent state? What if it was a form of potential energy? An unstable state that must, eventually, collapse back into a stable one? What if the fading was a sign that the two states, the object and its memory, were beginning to re-merge? The thought was so horrifying I had to sit down. What would happen to a tank? An M48 Patton tank that had been sitting in the desert for 55 years, rusting, decaying, if it was suddenly, violently, reunited with its own temporal signature from 9:07 a.m., July 10th, 1968. Would it simply reappear as it was in that moment? Or would the merging of two separate points in an object's timeline be a catastrophic event? A release of energy? An explosion? And what about Franklin? The man whose soul had been stolen, whose body had been lying in a catatonic state in a secret military hospital for more than half a century. What would happen to that empty, aging shell if its shadow, its now from 1968, suddenly tried to come home? The paradox was unthinkable. A young man's consciousness trying to re-inhabit an old man's body. It would be a collision of temporal states that would tear him apart from the inside out. The fading of the echoes was not a sign of healing. It was the precursor to a collapse, a temporal earthquake, the final, delayed, and monstrously unpredictable aftershock of the bomb we had detonated half a century ago. That is why, I am making this recording. That is why I am breaking my silence. The men who are watching that sight, the modern incarnation of the quiet men in suits, they may see the fading as a good thing, a sign that their problem is solving itself, that the doom is finally, truly sealing itself. They are wrong. They are sitting on a new kind of bomb. A bomb made of time itself, with a 55-year fuse that is about to run out. My name is Julian Croft. I am a man who helped to tear a hole in the fabric of the world, and I have a terrible sinking feeling that the hole is not closing. It is about to snap shut, and I do not know what will be caught in its jaws when it does. The secret of Tombstone is not just about what happened in the past. It is about what is about to happen very, very soon. The stain we left on the desert did not just stay behind. It has been waiting, and its wait is almost over. The tape turns. The silence in this room is a thick, heavy blanket, and my voice, I know, is a small, thin needle trying to stitch together a story that has been torn apart by time and secrecy. To make you understand what we saw, what we created, I must do more than just recount the events. I must show you the thinking. I must take you inside the frantic, terrified, and brilliant mind of Dr. Eris Thorne. Because in the days between the first appearance of the moving shadows and the final, terrible incident with young Franklin, we were not just observers. We were academics in hell, trying to write a dissertation on the physics of a nightmare. Our lives shrank to the confines of that observation bunker. The world outside, with its politics and its wars, ceased to exist. Our entire universe was the two-way mirror that looked out onto the silent, dancing pantomime of the shadows. And our Bible, our only sacred text in this new, broken religion, was Eris's notebook. It was a standard-issue, government-stamped logbook with a plain black cover. But the things she was scrawling inside it were anything but standard. Her handwriting, usually a model of neat, academic precision, had devolved into a frantic, chaotic scrawl. The pages were a wild storm of equations, diagrams, and hastily written notes that bordered on the poetic, the philosophical. She was a scientist trying to describe a ghost, and she was forced to invent a new language to do it. I remember one night, it must have been 3 a.m, the bunker was lit by the dim red glow of the night cycle lamps. Colonel Davis was asleep in his chair, a rare moment of peace for a man who seemed to be powered by pure, grim duty. I was at the main observation scope, watching the two-dimensional soldier endlessly trying to light a cigarette that wasn't there. The repetition was a form of madness, a visual mantra that was starting to fray the edges of my own sanity. Oris was at the small work table we had set up, a pen clutched in her hand, her brow furrowed in a concentration so intense it seemed to generate its own heat. The only sound was the scratch of her pen on the paper and the low, ever-present hum of the air conditioners. "It's not a projection," she said suddenly, not looking up. Her voice made me jump. "I keep trying to model it as a form of light projection, a complex hologram, but the energy readings don't support it. There is no external energy source, no projector. The shadows, they are their own source." "Then what are they?" I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. She finally looked up, her eyes wide and burning with a terrifying, exhilarating light. The look of a mind on the verge of a breakthrough so profound it might also be a form of insanity. "They are a state of matter, Julian. A new one. We have solids, liquids, gases, plasma. And now, we have this. A two-dimensional, temporally locked state of existence. A state of pure echo." She turned her notebook around so I could see it. On the page was a drawing. It was a simple diagram of a man. Next to it, she had drawn a second, identical man. A line connected the two. But underneath the second man, she had written an equation that made my blood run cold. It was a variation of Schrödinger's wave function, but she had added a new, theoretical variable. a variable she had designated with the Greek letter tau for time, and she had modified it to account for not just probability, but memory. Everything that exists has a waveform, she explained, her finger tracing the equation. A quantum signature. You, me, that tank out there. We exist as a wave of probability that has collapsed into a single, definite state. The present moment. Your theory, the theory behind the Chimera device, was that we could de-collapse that state, to push an object back into a state of pure probability, to make it cease to exist in a definite form. But it failed, I said. The memory of our initial disappointment's still a bitter taste. Everything is still there, physically. No, she said, shaking her head. It didn't fail. It worked better than we ever imagined. The resonance wave didn't just decollapse the present state. It was so powerful, so precise, that it separated the two components of the wave function. It separated the physical object from its own informational signature, its memory, its passage through time. She drew another diagram, a line representing time. She drew a circle on the line. This is the tank now, she said. Then she drew a second circle just above the line, connected by a dotted line. And this is the tank's existence at 9:07 a.m. on July 10th. The Chimera device didn't destroy the tank. It performed a form of psychic surgery. It cleaved the tank's now from the tank's then. And the then, it has been left behind. It has been imprinted on the ground, like a fossil of a single moment. I stared at her notes, at the impossible, beautiful, terrifying elegance of her theory. A fossilized moment, a living memory. But they're moving, Eris, I argued. A fossil doesn't move. A memory doesn't get up and dance. Doesn't it? She countered, a wild glint in her eye. What is a memory, Julian? But a story we tell ourselves, over and over again? A loop of neural activity in the brain. What we have created here is a memory that is no longer trapped in the soft, wet, organic machine of a brain. It is trapped in the very fabric of space-time itself. The loop is not a thought. It is a physical law for that specific, localized area. The soldier's shadow isn't choosing to light that cigarette. It is compelled to. The universe in that spot now has a new rule. At this location, this pattern of shadow must repeat this action. It is a scar, a glitch, a piece of reality that has been programmed to repeat a single line of code, forever. Her pen flew across the page again, sketching out complex field diagrams, notations on temporal mechanics that I had only ever seen in the most speculative of theoretical papers. She was writing the physics of haunting, the mathematics of a ghost story. On the last page of her notes from that night, she wrote a single, chilling paragraph. I have it memorized. I have recited it to myself in the dark 1,000 times. Conclusion, she wrote. The Chimera event did not create a weapon of mass destruction. It created a weapon of mass perception. The primary effect is not physical, but ontological. We have discovered a method for separating a being from its own narrative. The body remains, a mindless automaton in the present. But the soul, the consciousness, the temporal signature, whatever we choose to call the essence of being, is left behind, trapped in a two-dimensional echo of its final, coherent moment. We have not invented a way to kill people. We have invented a way to turn them into stories. And the site is now a library of these terrible, silent stories. A library written in a language of living shadows. The question is no longer what they are, but what they want. Do stories get lonely? Do they get hungry? The question hung there, on the page, a prophecy of the horror that was to come with Franklin. She had seen it. She had predicted it. In the cold, clean logic of her equations, She had foreseen the hunger of the ghosts we had made. We were not just guarding a place. We were guarding a predator that was made of yesterday. The 55 years since Tombstone have been a long, slow haunting. Not of the supernatural kind. I have never seen a ghost, not in the traditional sense. My haunting has been one of physics. A slow, creeping corruption of my own perception of reality, born from the knowledge of what we did, of what we witnessed. When you have seen the fundamental laws of the universe bend and break, you can never again look at the world with the same sense of solid, dependable certainty. I live in a world of ghosts that only I can see. They are not the spirits of the dead. They are the ghosts of moments, the faint, shimmering echoes of what I know to be true about the nature of time and shadow. It is a subtle madness, a quiet, personal, psychological war that has been waged inside my own skull for more than half a century. It began in the years immediately following the incident. I would be walking across the university campus on a bright, sunny day. I would see the sharp, dark shadow of a student walking ahead of me. And for a fraction of a second, a single, terrifying beat of my heart, the shadow would seem to lag. It would appear to be a single footstep behind the person casting it, a momentary, almost imperceptible temporal dislocation. I would blink, my heart pounding, and the shadow would be back where it belonged, clinging to the student's feet like a loyal dog. But the image, the momentary wrongness, would stay with me for the rest of the day, a cold knot of dread in my stomach. Was it real? Was I actually perceiving a tiny quantum-level temporal shear? Or was it a scar on my own mind, my brain, now conditioned to see the impossible, projecting its trauma onto the world? I don't know. And that not knowing is the essence of my particular haunting. I'm a physicist who can no longer trust his own observations. I'm a prisoner in the unreliable jail of my own senses. The paranoia became a part of my daily routine. I developed a series of obsessive, compulsive rituals, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world I knew to be fundamentally chaotic. I check my own shadow constantly. On the rare occasions I'm forced to go out in the sun, I find myself glancing down at the ground every few seconds, a frantic, repetitive motion, just to make sure it's still there, still properly attached, still obeying the rules. I have a deep, irrational fear of bright, direct light. Flash photography can send me into a cold sweat. I cannot watch old movies, the kind with sharp, high-contrast black and white cinematography. The shadows in those films seem too independent, too real. And then there is the memory of Franklin. That is the ghost that never, ever leaves me. He is my constant, silent accuser. I see his face in crowds. I see his empty, vacant eyes staring back at me from my own reflection in a dark window. I know, with a certainty that is beyond any scientific proof, that his body is still alive, somewhere. It is lying in a bed in a secret government hospital, a nameless, ageless shell, being kept alive by machines. A man who is 80 years old on the outside, but whose soul is forever 24, forever trapped in a two-dimensional loop, reaching for a card that isn't there. My guilt over what happened to him, over my own powerlessness in that moment, became the primary weapon in my own self-inflicted psychological war. I would have nightmares, not of the shadows themselves, but of visiting Franklin in that hospital. In the dream, I would walk into his room, and he would be sitting up in his bed. He would turn to look at me, and his eyes would be clear. He would smile, and he would say, "You left me behind, Doctor. You left me in the story." I would wake up screaming, my own voice a raw, ragged sound in the silent house. This long, slow internal war has taken its toll. I have never married. I have never had a family. How could I? How could I get close to someone knowing that the fundamental reality I perceive is Suspect? How could I explain why I can't go for a walk on a sunny beach? How could I explain the sudden, sharp intake of my breath when a shadow moves in an unexpected way? I've been in a state of self-imposed quarantine for my entire adult life, not to protect the world from my secret, but to protect myself from a world that is too bright, too sharp, too full of shadows that I no longer trust. The men who quarantined me, the quiet men in their quiet suits, they thought they were just burying a secret. They didn't understand. They can build a wall around the Tombstone site. They can classify the documents and erase the names, but they cannot build a wall around a memory. They cannot quarantine an idea. And the idea that we created, the idea that time and identity are severable, that a person can be separated from their own now, that idea escaped with me. It has been my cellmate for 55 years. The cryptic message, the echoes of fading, has only intensified this war. It has given my quiet, theoretical ghosts a new and terrible urgency. The haunting is no longer just a passive state of being. It is now a countdown. My paranoia has a deadline. The lagging shadows I imagine I see. The fear of my own reflection. It is all now cast against the backdrop of a coming cataclysm. A temporal collapse. The end of the story. This is the real nature of the horror of Tombstone. It is not a monster that you can fight. It is not a disease you can cure. It is a piece of knowledge that once known can never be unknown. It is a fundamental crack in the lens through which you see the universe. And once you have seen it, you can never see the world as whole again. You are forever haunted by the light. The decision to make this recording was not a single sudden act of defiance. It was a slow, agonizing process, a geological shift in the landscape of my own fear. For 55 years, my silence was the cornerstone of my existence. It was the price I had paid for my life, for my freedom, such as it was. To speak, to break that oath, was to pull the pin from a grenade that had been resting in my own hand for more than half a century. I knew, with an absolute and unwavering certainty, that the moment I began to tell this story, I was signing my own death warrant. The photograph and the note were the catalyst, the spark. But the real decision was made in the long, dark, silent nights that followed. I would sit here, in this chair, in this quiet, dusty room, and I would weigh the equations. On one side of the ledger was my own life. The quiet, lonely, but safe existence of Robert Anderson, the retired professor. The morning coffee. The walk to the mailbox. The rustle of the newspaper. The small, meaningless, but precious rituals of a life that was, at least, still being lived. And on the other side of the ledger was the fading of the echoes, the coming collapse, the final, terrible, unanswered question of what we had truly unleashed. I thought about the men who had sent me that note. The they, the quiet men, the guardians of the secret. They were not my friends. They were my jailers. But in a strange, twisted way, I understood them. I understood their fear. They were men who had stared into the same abyss I had, and they had chosen the path of absolute control, of absolute denial. They believed that humanity was a child that had to be protected from the sharp, dangerous truths of the universe. They were wrong, I believed, but their motives were not born of malice. They were born of a profound, paternalistic, and terrified sense of duty. But the new generation, the ones who were now watching the Tombstone site, the ones who had sent me that satellite photo, did they understand the true nature of the threat? Did they have Eris's notes? Did they comprehend her final, terrifying theory? Or did they just see a strange, anomalous phenomenon that was, thankfully, disappearing? Did they see the fading as a resolution, a happy ending to a long and dirty chapter of their secret history? That was the fear that tipped the scales. The fear that they were watching a bomb count down, and they thought it was a clock winding down. The fear that their ignorance, their lack of the full context, would lead them to do nothing. And when the collapse came, when the temporal earthquake struck, they would be as surprised as we were on that first terrible day. They would be unprepared. The world would be unprepared. My silence, which I had once seen as a necessary shield to protect the world, now seemed like a betrayal. I was the last living witness from the core design team. I was the only one left who had been there from the beginning, who had seen the pristine equations on the chalkboard before they had become a nightmare of living shadows on the desert floor. I was the only one who could provide the full context. My testimony was the missing variable in their equation. So, the choice became clear. It was a choice between my own small, insignificant life and the possibility, however slim, that my words could serve as a warning. A choice between a quiet, natural death in my bed in a few years, or a quiet, unnatural death at the hands of the men in suits, sooner rather than later. When I framed it like that, it was no longer a choice. It was a duty, a final posthumous duty to my colleague, my mentor, my friend, Eris Thorne. A duty to her brilliance and to the truth she had died to understand, even if her death had been a slow, quiet one in a cage of secrecy. The act of preparing for this recording was a ritual of its own, a final putting of my affairs in order. I went through my small house, and I destroyed anything that connected me to my old life. Old photographs, a few cherished textbooks from my university days, a letter from my mother, dated 1967. I burned them all in a small metal trash can in my backyard, watching the smoke curl up into the gray Oregon sky. It was a second funeral, a funeral for the ghost of Julian Croft. Then I went to the closet in my study, and on the top shelf, in a dusty cardboard box, was the cassette recorder. I hadn't touched it in years. I bought it in the early 90s, a moment of passing paranoia, and then had never used it. I took it out. I blew the dust off its plastic casing. I found a sealed package of blank 90-minute tapes. Maxell. The brand name seemed like a cruel joke. I sat down at this table. I put the tape in the machine. I looked at the small, red, circular record button. For a long time, I just looked at it. It was the button from the bunker, all over again. A small, simple, plastic switch that could unleash a force of unimaginable consequence. In 1968, pressing that button had torn a hole in the world. Now pressing this button would tear a hole in the silence that had defined my life. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I thought of Jennings. I thought of Oster. I thought of Franklin. I thought of Eris. And I made a different choice this time. In the bunker, my pressing of the button had been an act of scientific hubris. This was an act of penance. I pressed the button. There was a soft, mechanical click. The two small reels began to turn. The tape began to move, silent and expectant. I had crossed the point of no return. I'd spoken my name into the microphone, a word that was a key to a locked and forbidden history. And I knew that with that first spoken word, I had started a new countdown. The countdown to the moment when a quiet, polite knock would fall upon my door, and the guardians of the secret would come to collect their final overdue debt. To truly convey the weight of my warning, I must do more than just speak of theories and fears. I must take you back. I must force myself to descend into the sharpest, most painful corner of my memory. I must walk you through the anatomy of the moment that everything changed. I must tell you about the last day of a young man named Richard Franklin. Franklin was a good kid. He was only 23, fresh out of Caltech, with a mind that was a razor blade and a kind of fearless, almost reckless curiosity. He saw the Tombstone phenomenon not with the terror that had gripped the rest of us, but with a kind of giddy, intellectual excitement. He was a physicist who had been given the chance to see a new law of nature being born, and he was not afraid. He was thrilled. That was his undoing. It was the 15th day of the incident, a Tuesday. The sun was a merciless white disk in a bleached blue sky. The heat was a physical pressure. The shadows, our two-dimensional ghosts, were in the middle of their silent, looping ballet. We'd become almost accustomed to them, their constant silent motion a new kind of normal. It was the kind of normalization of the insane that allows a person to function in a madhouse. Colonel Davis was getting impatient. The reports he was sending back to the Pentagon were filled with observations but no conclusions, no solutions. He was a man who needed to do something, and our passive observation was grating on his military soul. "I need a closer reading," he had said that morning, his jaw tight. "I need to know if the resonance field is expanding. I need hard data. Franklin, you're up." Eris had protested vehemently. "Colonel, that's an unnecessary risk. We don't know the nature of the field's boundary. We don't know if it's stable." "It has been stable for 2 weeks, Doctor," Davis had countered, his voice sharp. "And I have my orders. My orders are to ascertain the perimeter of the effect. Franklin is the best sensor tech we have. He will go. He will be in a full-body environmental suit. He will not enter the active echo field. He will approach to a distance of 10 feet, take his readings, and return. It is a minimal, acceptable risk." And so, Franklin suited up. I remember watching him on the monitors as he walked out of the bunker. He gave a cheerful, confident wave to the camera. He was walking towards the greatest discovery in human history, a portable sensor array in his hands, and he looked like a kid on his way to a science fair. He walked slowly, deliberately, across the sun-baked ground, his boots crunching on the gravel. We watched his progress on a dozen different screens, a long-range shot, a close-up from a telephoto lens, a constant stream of data from the sensors he was carrying. His own, real, solid shadow stretched out long and thin behind him, a faithful companion. He approached the group of shadows at the card table. They were the most active, the most defined of all the echoes. A silent, endless game of poker, played by two-dimensional ghosts. From our vantage point, it was like watching a fly approach a spider's web. "I'm at 50 feet from the primary echo," Franklin's voice came over the radio, clear and calm. "All sensor readings are stable. The resonance field is holding steady." He continued his slow, careful walk. 25 feet. Still no change. The field boundary appears to be sharp. Very defined. Eris was leaning forward, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the console. "Franklin, that's close enough," she said into her microphone. "We have the data we need. Come back now." "Just a few more feet, Doctor," Franklin's voice replied, a hint of his excitement breaking through his professional calm. "I want to get a reading on the spectral absorption. It's beautiful. It's like looking at a hole in the universe." He took another step, and another. He was at the 10-foot mark. He stopped. He raised his sensor array. He was a model of scientific precision, a man doing his job. And that is when the rules changed. On our monitors, we saw the shadow of the mannequin that was reaching for the cards suddenly stop. Its smooth, looping motion ceased. For a single, terrible second, it was still. Then, it turned. Not its whole body, just the part that would have been its head. The two-dimensional shape on the ground seemed to lift, to peel itself from its pre-programmed path, and it looked at Franklin. I swear to God it looked at him. "What the?" Franklin's voice on the radio was a confused whisper. The shadow detached itself from the table. It flowed across the ground towards him. It moved with a speed that was impossible, a liquid, silent horror. It was not a shadow anymore. It was a predator. "Franklin! Run!" Eris screamed, her voice a raw, primal sound of terror. Franklin turned to run, but he was frozen for a crucial second, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. The dark, flat shape reached him. It flowed over his boots, up his legs. It did not touch his physical body. It merged with his shadow. For one single, horrifying moment, on the monitor, we saw the two shadows become one. A chaotic, writhing shape of pure blackness on the desert floor. And then we saw a tearing, a ripping. It was not a physical tearing. It was a tearing of something more fundamental. The echo shadow pulled back, retreating to its card table. But it was no longer alone. It was trailing a piece of Franklin's shadow behind it. A dark, ragged umbilical cord. Franklin himself stumbled back, a choked, guttural sound coming from his throat. He looked down. We all looked down. The ground around his feet, where his shadow should have been, was a blank. A perfect, empty, sun-drenched patch of desert. He was an object in the world, and he no longer had a place to cast his darkness. He stood there for 3 eternal seconds. His body was a statue. Then his head tilted back, and he let out a single, long, empty sigh. The sound of a balloon deflating. The sound of a soul leaving its vessel. And he collapsed in a heap on the ground. The scene at the card table had changed. Franklin's shadow, torn and ragged, was now there. It had pulled itself to its feet, and it had joined the game. It was reaching for the card, its 2-dimensional hand moving in a smooth, perfect, eternal loop. A new actor had joined the silent play. A new story was being told. We recovered his body. The medics rushed out, their faces pale with a fear that was beyond their training. They put him on a stretcher. I will never, ever forget the sight of them carrying him back to the bunker. A young man, lying on a stretcher in the full, brutal glare of the Arizona sun, casting no shadow at all. It was the most obscene, the most profoundly, fundamentally wrong thing I've ever seen. And I knew in that moment that we had not just failed. We had committed a sin against the very nature of reality. We had created a monster, and it had just, with a silent, indifferent grace, devoured a man's soul. The aftermath of the Franklin incident was the end of the science and the beginning of the cover-up. But in the final hours before our team was torn apart and the walls of secrecy went up forever, Eris and I had one last frantic, desperate conversation. We had locked ourselves in the small data analysis room, a single, grainy, frozen image of Franklin's empty shadow on the main screen. It was our memento mori, the icon of our failure. Eris was not weeping. She was beyond that. She was in a state of cold, crystalline, intellectual fury. She was a mathematician who had just seen her perfect, elegant equations manifest as a soul-eating monster, and she was trying to understand the nature of the beast she had helped create. My theory was incomplete, she said, her voice a low, intense whisper. She was pacing back and forth in the small room, a caged tiger of intellect. I called the shadows memories, echoes. I was being too poetic. I was thinking in terms of metaphor. I should have been thinking in terms of pure physics. She grabbed a grease pencil and began to draw on the glass of the observation window, her hand moving with a frantic, desperate energy. She drew diagrams of space-time, of world lines, of quantum states. It was a beautiful, terrifying scroll. We didn't just separate the object from its temporal signature, she said, her back to me. That's too simple. What we did was more brutal. Think of an object's existence in time as a thread, a single, continuous thread running from its creation to its destruction. The Chimera device didn't just pause a section of that thread. The resonance wave acted like a pair of scissors. It cut the thread. She drew a line, and then she drew a sharp, jagged break in the middle of it. So, what we have at the Tombstone site, she continued, is a collection of objects whose temporal threads have been severed from their now. Their past still exists. Their future, presumably, still exists in a state of potentiality. But their present moment has been excised. We created a fleet of ships, and we cut them loose from their anchors in the river of time. And the shadows? I asked, my voice barely audible. The shadows are the anchor, she said, turning to face me, her eyes burning. They are the visible, two-dimensional representation of that connection to the now. When we severed the connection, the anchor was left behind. But it's not just an anchor. It's a wound, a temporal wound, and a wound wants to heal. This was the new, horrifying piece of her theory. The shadows are not just replaying a memory out of some blind physical compulsion, she explained. They are trying to re-establish the connection, the looping motion, the reenactment. It's a form of temporal resonance. They are vibrating at the frequency of their own last coherent moment, trying to find their other half, the physical object they were once connected to. They are calling out, in a language of physics, trying to bridge the gap we created. And Franklin, I whispered. Her face grew dark. Franklin was a mistake, a catastrophic miscalculation. His own temporal signature, his own now, was a stable, powerful, coherent resonance field. When he got too close to the wounded, unstable field of the echo, the two fields interacted. The echo, in its desperate attempt to find an anchor, to heal its own wound, did the only thing it could. It latched onto the nearest, most stable temporal signature it could find. It latched onto Franklin's shadow. She closed her eyes, as if the image was too painful to see even in her own mind. It wasn't an act of malice, Julian. It was an act of desperation. It was a drowning thing, pulling its rescuer under with it. It tore Franklin's now away from him, and it used his temporal energy to anchor itself, to stabilize its own broken existence. It didn't need his soul. It borrowed it, permanently. His consciousness is now the engine that is driving that two-dimensional ghost, forcing it to play out its loop, over and over again. He is the battery in a machine that will run forever. We were silent for a long time, the weight of her words settling over us like a physical shroud. We had not just created ghosts. We had created temporal vampires, wounded echoes of the past that could only sustain their ghostly existence by feeding on the present of the living. And it was in that moment that the final, terrible piece of my own theory, the one that has haunted me to this day, was born. It came from the cryptic message I received 55 years later. The echoes are fading. Eris believed the echoes were trying to heal, to re-establish a connection. But what if she was wrong? What if the fading was not a sign of healing, but a sign of decay? A system cannot remain in a state of high potential energy forever. The wound cannot bleed eternally. At some point, the energy must dissipate. The potential must collapse. The fading of the echoes is not a sign that the ghosts are disappearing. It is a sign that the temporal debt we created is finally coming due. The separation of object and memory, of body and now, is an unnatural state. And the universe, in its relentless, implacable drive for equilibrium, will eventually, violently, correct the equation. My final theory, the one I am recording now as my ultimate warning, is this. The collapse will not be a quiet fading into nothingness. It will be a violent reintegration. A moment when the universe forces the severed threads of time back together. And the energy released by that temporal reconciliation, the paradox of a 55-year-old object being violently merged with its own pristine, undamaged version from 1968, will not be subtle. It will be an explosion. Not of matter, but of causality. A localized Big Bang, not of space, but of time. A cancer of physics that could erase a patch of the Arizona desert not just from the map, but from history itself. The fading is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the final, terrible, and unwritten chapter. The Tombstone is not a monument. It is a fuse, and it has been burning for a very, very long time. The grandfather clock in the hall chimes the hour. Another hour closer to the inevitable knock on the door. Another hour closer to the moment the temporal debt at Tombstone comes due. The tape in this small machine continues its slow, relentless journey, spooling my life, my secrets, my final, desperate warning from one reel to the other. Soon, it will run out. And so will I. I sit here in the fog-shrouded quiet of the Oregon coast, an old man at the edge of the world, and I'm left with nothing but the ghosts and the equations. The ghosts of my colleagues, scattered and silenced by a secret they were not allowed to keep, and the ghost of a young man named Richard Franklin, whose soul is still playing cards with a shadow in the Arizona sun, and the equations. Eris's beautiful, terrible equations, the mathematics of a haunted world. For 55 years, I have lived with the consequences of a single, arrogant moment. A moment when we, a handful of clever, ambitious men and women, decided to play God. We decided to rewrite the fundamental laws of the universe to serve our own short-sighted terrestrial fears. We wanted a weapon to win the Cold War, and in our hubris, we created a weapon that declared war on time itself. The men who came after us, the guardians of our secret, they thought they had contained the problem. They built their wall. They buried the reports. They erased our names. They believed they had put the monster in a box. But they didn't understand the nature of the monster. You cannot build a wall high enough to contain a wound in causality. You cannot write a report classified enough to stop the laws of physics from seeking their own violent equilibrium. They did not contain the threat. They just put a 55-year fuse on it. And now, the fuse is burning down. The echoes are fading. The temporal potential energy of the site is decaying. The collapse is coming. What will it look like? My nights are filled with the visions of it, the nightmares of a theoretical physicist. I see a wave of chronological chaos expanding from the desert, a tsunami of paradox that rips through the world. I see buildings aging 1,000 years in a second, turning to dust. I see people de-aging, their memories unraveling, their existence flickering like a faulty light bulb. I see a cancer of time, a place where past, present, and future collide in a single, screaming, impossible moment. Or perhaps it will be more subtle, a quiet pop as the bubble of wounded space-time we created finally bursts, erasing that small patch of desert not just from geography, but from history itself, leaving behind a hole in the world so absolute that no one will even remember that anything was ever there. A perfect, final, and undetectable act of cosmic censorship. I do not know. That is the final, terrible truth. I am the man who wrote the first line of the equation, and I have no idea how to solve for the final variable. The package I received, the one with the satellite photo, was not just a warning. It was a plea. A cry for help from a new generation of guardians who have inherited a problem they do not understand. They have the what, but they do not have the why. They do not have Eris's notes. They do not have the theory of the temporal wound. They are doctors watching a patient die, and they do not even know the name of the disease. This tape is my attempt to give them that name. It is my attempt to give them the context, the theory, the terrible, foundational truth of what we did. Perhaps, with this knowledge, they can find a way to mitigate the collapse, to dampen the temporal shockwave, to find a way to heal the wound instead of just letting it burst. Perhaps they can build a new kind of device, not a chimera that cuts time, but a splint that can bind its severed threads back together. It is a faint hope, a desperate last-minute gamble, but it is the only hope I have left. The story I have told you is a terrible one. It is a story of science without wisdom, of power without restraint. It is a cautionary tale, etched in the language of living shadows and stolen souls. But it is not just a story of the past. It is a warning about the future. We live in an age of wonders, of technologies that would have seemed like magic to my younger self. We are splitting the atom in new ways. We are peering into the very fabric of the quantum realm. We are building machines that think. We are, all of us, every day, tinkering with the fundamental equations of existence. Let my story be a reminder of the responsibility that comes with that power. Let it be a reminder that for every new, beautiful equation we solve, we must also consider the ghosts that may be hiding within it. We must be more than just clever. We must be wise. We must be more than just scientists. We must be custodians. The tape has stopped. The leader is slapping softly, rhythmically, against the empty reel. The silence in the room rushes in to fill the void. My story is told. My part in this is done. I will take this tape. I will put it in a plain, manila envelope, and I will mail it to a journalist I have been following for years, a woman who is not afraid to ask the questions that the powerful do not want answered. And then, I will wait. I will sit in my chair, and I will watch the fog roll in from the ocean, and I will listen for the quiet, polite knock on my door. It will come. I have no doubt of that. The guardians will come to collect their ghost, but I am no longer afraid. My silence was a prison. The truth, even a truth as terrible as this one, is a form of freedom. I have spoken for the dead. I have spoken for the lost. I have spoken for Eris Thorne and for Richard Franklin. And I have, finally, solved for my own last variable. My name is Doctor Julian Croft, and I am no longer a ghost. I am a witness. They tried to bury a moment in time, but they forgot one thing. Time, eventually, gives up its dead, and a shadow, in the end, is just a testament to the fact that there was, once, a light. So, that's the story of Dr. Julian Croft and the Tombstone test site. It's a story that proves the most terrifying weapons aren't the ones that make the loudest noise, but the ones that leave behind the deepest silence. It's a chilling account of how the ambition to control the battlefield led to a war against the laws of physics itself. Officially, the Chimera project was a failure, a dud buried in the Arizona desert. But we know the truth now. The only thing they buried was the evidence. The echoes of that silent blast may still be there, waiting for their moment. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, or perhaps made you look at your own shadow with a little more suspicion, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, be careful where you step. The past is not as far behind us as we think, and sometimes it leaves a stain.